So our first presenter, we're very fortunate to have Professor Emad El-Omar, who's Professor of Medicine at the St George and Sutherland Clinical School at UNSW and Director of the Microbiome Research Centre at St George Hospital in Kogarah. He graduated in medicine from Glasgow in Scotland and trained as a gastroenterologist in the UK, and he's also trained at Vanderbilt in the US and the National Cancer Institute. And he's editor-in-chief of the journal Gut. So if you need to know anything about guts, he's the man. So I'll pass over to Professor El-Omar.
Thank you, Mark, and good afternoon, gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be invited to speak to you today on a topic that I think is becoming very, very popular. I'm sure all of you will have been bombarded by the concept of gut health and the microbiome and so forth. So I think it's very appropriate to have that part of this learning module about obesity and cancer because they're so interlinked with the microbiome. Just by way of introduction, a couple of definitions. We talk about the microbiome, we talk about the microbiota. The microbiota are essentially the bugs, all the living organisms that are actually in us and on us. They could be bacteria, viruses, archaea, and so forth. And the microbiome is the collective genes or genetic power of those microbiota and possibly what they produce, so their kind of metabolic output as well. So that's the microbiome, this collective of the genes and their products. It's as heavy as your brain, if you kind of add them all up, and it's metabolically active, the same activity as the liver. So imagine having that extra organ within your body that is doing as much metabolism as your liver. So obviously, it is interlinked with quite a few of your physiological as well as disease associations. Now, it's interesting how it's set up and constructed. We assume that you're sterile in utero, although this is actually debated quite heavily. But from the moment of birth, there is this exposure to the outside world and acquisition of the microbiome that will set the scene for the rest of your life. And in fact, one of the biggest questions is where does it come from? And this particular study looked at that in great detail. This was published very recently and tracked mothers and their babies and sampled the mother's oral, vaginal, skin, and stool microbiomes, and then followed the babies up for a day or 4 days or 4 months to see what happens to those microbiota that are transferred from the mother. Now, the take-home message is that most of the baby's microbiota actually come from the mother, and by 4 months, essentially the majority of the bugs inside the gut of the baby come from the mother. Now, that has major health implications because that health of the baby, when it grows up as a child and then as an adult, already has some kind of either an advantage or some baggage. And if it's inherited a dysbiotic or a disordered microbiome, this may have an impact on the baby's health. We talk about vaginal delivery versus cesarean sections. All of these have been associated with health outcomes, and this all revolves around the microbiome. The other question is whether this is sterility in utero or not. This paper just published literally a few days ago showed that in fact, if you looked at the placenta, you couldn't identify any specific microbiota, but it was essentially the same as the reagents that you use to extract the DNA. Now, I think this study is actually flawed because the mere fact that the reagents had microbiota suggests that nothing is sterile. So I think it's just a matter of time before we can resolve this question. Now, the other thing is the effect of environment versus your genes. Are you predisposed to having a particular set of microbiota, or is it the environment that establishes that? This is a beautiful study that was published, again, very recently in Israel, where they looked at families that come from different ethnic backgrounds. In other words, they cohabit. They looked at their genes and they found that, in fact, the most important determinant is essentially the environment. So if you share the same household, if you're married to somebody from a different ethnic background, you share the same microbiome despite having different genes. And this was confirmed by another very large study from China, again published very recently, that looked at Guangdong province, whereby they had a population of 104 million, and they divided them into 14 districts, and then looked at the microbiomes of 7,000 people. And again, they showed that the most important determinant of the composition of your microbiome is geography. And again, that makes sense because it depends on what you eat, what food you consume, where it's being grown, what soil it's growing in, what insecticides or pesticides or whatever it is were used. All of these things are geographically determined, so that's far more important than anything else. Now, the relevance in terms of health of these kind of studies is that if you're trying to define a signature of disease, say like obesity or type 2 diabetes or metabolic syndrome, in one suburb, which is so distant from another, it might not be the same. So that disease signature needs to be kind of adjusted to the geography that you have. So that was the take-home message. Two very important concepts in the microbiome field. One is diversity. Diversity is good. So if you take a stool sample and it has a lot of diversity as an index, that correlates with health. And equally in diseases like obesity or cancer, you lose that diversity. So that's a very important concept. The second is that of dysbiosis, and that's an imbalance where you have a proliferation of what we call pathobionts, these are the bad guys, that then drive a low-grade inflammation, and that's really the root of all evil, that kind of dysbiosis at the gut barrier whereby there is inflammation and leakage, so the idea of a leaky gut, that then translocates all of these components, whether it's bugs or their products, into the rest of the circulation, and you get this kind of metabolic endotoxemia, which affects so many diseases like obesity and cardiovascular disease. Now, so many different causes of dysbiosis. I won't have time to go through all of them, but as I mentioned already, diet is very important. The aging process, as you grow older, there is a tendency towards kind of a dysbiosis, but it's not inevitable. We have studies in centenarians who are incredibly healthy and have a diversity that is greater than people who are 30 years old. So it's not an inevitable thing. Actually, it depends on the lifestyle that you've led. One very important category there that affects the microbiome, I'll talk about it later, is medications. So what we give will impact on the microbiome in a big way, not just the antibiotics, but other medications. This is just demonstrating again this kind of leaky gut hypothesis, whereby you get an imbalance, perhaps due to diet, perhaps due to other factors, and then you get a leaky gut, whereby you get translocation of either the microbiota itself or its products, and then they can spread everywhere and affect distant organs like the kidneys or the brain or the endothelial surfaces and so forth. So again, it's a very important concept. Now, why is this relevant to metabolism and obesity and so forth? Imagine all of these little bugs lying there and being exposed to your what you feed them. It could be indigestible fiber, it could be xenobiotics, or it could be anything at all. And they're tiny little factories that are metabolizing these things and producing other metabolites that then obviously impact on your health. So you have this collective organ that is essentially working in the background and affecting all of these interactions with your immune system, with your endocrine system, with your nervous system, and so forth. And all of these obviously have an impact. Now, just a little kind of, again, going back to metabolism, this is a very interesting study, and it made the headlines. I'm sure some of you have seen this. This is in Nature Medicine, and it looked at the Boston Marathon runners. So they tracked their microbiome a few days before the event and for a few days after the event. And they showed that obviously these people are fit, and they showed that in fact there is a proliferation in these athletes after the event of a particular bacteria called Veillonella. And Veillonella atypia in particular was fascinating because this enriched in those athletes after the event. When they took the poo from these athletes and then transplanted it into a mouse model and then exercised these mice, they were able to increase their maximal capacity by 15%. Now imagine what you can do with that if you're training as an athlete. But more importantly, imagine what can that do to people who have no capacity to exercise. For example, cancer patients, and the sarcopenia and the effect of the kind of the negative aspects of the cancer, and having something like this that could be delivered in a capsule or to allow you to increase your exercise level would be obviously very, very interesting. Now, the interesting thing about this particular study is that if you looked at athletes and they exercise, all of you that go to the gym and overdo it, and you feel the pain in your muscles, that's due to lactic acid. Now, those bacteria that are enriched due to exercise then metabolize the lactic acid into propionate, so from lactate to propionate, and this propionate is having the positive effects on the metabolism and allow you to increase your level of exercise and activity. Fascinating stuff, and I think it will have major impacts. Medications I mentioned, apart from things like antibiotics, of course, they can wipe out big tribes of your microbiota, but other non-antibiotic medications are just as important. And this study that was published again last year looked at more than 1,100 non-antibiotic drugs, all of the stuff that we prescribe as doctors, and found that a quarter of them have a direct bactericidal effect on at least one or two or more of a panel of commensals. They check this in culture. So they can kill off some of those good guys, they can kill off some of the bad guys, And that really explains some of the kind of inexplicable side effects that we see sometimes with certain medications. Now, number one group in those drugs that they've tested that came up top in terms of its effect on the microbiome are the antipsychotics. And we're all very familiar with the side effects of antipsychotics, is that the patients become obese, they develop cardiovascular increased risk, and they die of heart attacks and so forth, and increased risk of cancer, obesity, cancer, and so forth. Now, this effect of the medications is a new revelation, and there are studies now being done, even here in Sydney, looking at the effect of the antipsychotics on the microbiome and how we can actually prevent that and reverse that if possible. Now, in terms of cardiovascular disease, again, it's the same concept. If you disrupt that barrier, this metabolic endotoxemia, you eat the wrong stuff, you eat a lot of meat, for example, you have L-carnitine and choline and so forth, and these are converted into TMA, trimethylamine, and gets to the liver and then metabolized into TMAO. Now, this is an atherogenic substance. This is an atherogenic metabolite that is being shown to increase the risk of cardiovascular disease and so forth. We'll just move on in the interest of time. Yep, sure. Now, just quickly on chemotherapy, again, the drugs have an effect on your microbiome, and the microbiome has an effect on the efficacy and the side effects of your chemotherapy. Now, this has been established, and more excitingly in the last year as well, we've learned that, in fact, immunotherapy, the success and efficacy of immunotherapy is also determined by a signature of the microbiota in the stool. Now, this would have been sci-fi a few years ago, but all of a sudden this has galvanized the oncology field, and these studies were published on melanoma and non-small cell lung cancer, renal cell cancer. And if you take the stool from those mice, from those patients that responded to immunotherapy and put them into a mouse model, those mice become also responsive to the immunotherapy. So again, there are now clinical trials. MD Anderson is doing a big trial now in melanoma using stool, FMT, fecal microbiota transplantation, from responsive patients to de novo patients. This is very exciting stuff, and I think it will deliver a lot of translational benefit. I'm running out of time, but this is just a quick slide showing you the different ways that we can manipulate the microbiota. Now, a lot of trials are now being done in terms of obesity, in terms of cancer, in terms of diabetes, and so many other conditions, and trying to kind of rationalize the use of fecal microbiota transplantation or products of that stool that could be packaged in a more palatable way. Now, this is something that is developing very fast. Again, I've run out of time. I apologize about that, but there are some really hot potential probiotics like Akkermansia, which is, again, sort of filtered into the news recently and had been tested in clinical trials in terms of metabolic syndrome and obesity, and had shown great promise. You can deliver this either as a live Akkermansia or as a heat inactivated. So there's a lot of potential there to try and allow us to use of these in our clinical trials in cancer and obesity. Apologies about the excess time, but I tried to do it in 10 minutes. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.